For most people, when you talk about Lee Kuan Yew's legacy, what comes to mind is Singapore being wealthy, being efficient, honest government, and so on and so forth. But you have to ask yourself, that is a certain, to a great extent, true. But you have to ask yourself what underpins that. And the other half of his legacy is that he concentrated power very much in his own hands. In order to achieve these things, the wealth, the efficiency, the honest government, he steadily undermined the institutions of government, the independence of many institutions, and concentrated power in his own hands. So his legacy is also very much one-man rule in Singapore, but one wrapped up with a veneer of parliamentary democracy. And that's really what we're seeing falling apart now, because one-man rule is basically unsustainable. Maybe if that one man is someone as brilliant as Lee Kuan Yew, but in the long term, as we've seen over and over again in history, one-man rule simply is not sustainable. Lee Kuan Yew basically learned a lot from his British colonial masters. He collaborated closely with them in the 60s, and what happened was that he learned two really important things. The first is that by creating an atmosphere of fear, right, a climate of fear, you can use that to justify the abrogation of democracy, anti-democratic measures, authoritarian measures. And with that, once you've got complete control of the legislative process, you can then pass illiberal legislation, anti-democratic legislation, through the form of democracy, but not the substance of it. And so that's what he did. In around 63 onwards, he used the fear of communism during the Cold War to arrest and detain or expel his political opponents. By 1968, he had complete control of parliament. Every single seat belonged to his party. And from then on, you see this steady erosion of Singapore's democratic freedoms and liberties, but more importantly, the erosion of the independence of state institutions. And so he passed all these laws through parliament that steadily concentrated power in his hands. And so what has happened basically is that this pattern has been inherited, this system has been inherited by Lee Hsien Loong, who is doing the same thing. These decisions are made in advance by Lee Kuan Yew, by Lee Hsien Loong, either by themselves or with their trusted advisors. And then after that, they are passed through the form of democratic consultation and deliberation and through the legislative process, and then thereby legitimized. But really, the decisions were a foregone conclusion. And that's what Lee Wai Ling and Lee Hsien Yang are really upset about. For many years, they of course benefited from this system, but now the system is being used against them. Right? A decision that Lee Hsien Loong made about the house at Oxley Road is probably has been taken in advance, but what's happened is that he then convened the committee to legitimize this decision, to give it a veneer of parliamentary democracy in order to wash his hands clean, to keep his hands clean, and to say that it was done the proper way. But it's a foregone conclusion. So what Lee Kuan Yew bequeathed was a system which actually relied very heavily on the personal authority of Lee Kuan Yew. And that is what his son has inherited. Now, the problem with a system where so much power is concentrated in the hands of one man is that the interests of that one man, from his own perspective, become indistinguishable from the interests of the state. And as long as that one man was Lee Kuan Yew, there was a very clear harmony of the man and the state. But now the Lee family is three people, and they have very different interests, very different perspectives. And so they're fighting each other. But their battle over the legacy of Lee Kuan Yew demonstrates very clearly how authority in Singapore still stems from Lee Kuan Yew, not from Lee Hsien Loong. Lee Hsien Loong, of course, is now fighting back by using the machinery of the state against them, which shows just how much his personal and the national interests have blurred together, right? Again, part of Lee Kuan Yew's legacy. But his siblings are fighting back against him with the only real weapon they have, which is to try and deprive him of the authority of Lee Kuan Yew. So what we have today is actually a very brittle system, which is still reliant on the personal authority of a dead man. And that's why this issue of Lee Kuan Yew's legacy is so important now. As academics have proven, for example, in Michael Barr's work, the Lee family is central to Singapore. They hold all the levers of power. One of the very interesting things in Michael Barr's work was he demonstrated that the biggest correlation between elite status in Singapore, in other words, a leadership position in the political or judicial or the civil service, was a pre-existing relationship with the Lee family. In other words, that predates that person taking up that post. And that suggests that the Lee family isn't merely just one family, but they have a network of people across Singapore who occupy critical positions of power and who all have very close personal relationships with the Lee family. So it's more than just one family. And it also, again, right, it's a very brittle system, because if that family falls apart, all these other relationships are affected. So their squabble isn't merely one just of a single family. It's very much of national interest as well. There's this joke about Lee Kuan Yew being everyone's grandfather, right? He was omnipresent, and for most Singaporeans, in our living memory, there has always been a Lee either in charge or sitting in the cabinet or hovering over the shoulder of the Prime Minister. So the Lee family is in many ways our first family, but because of this close association of Lee Kuan Yew with Singapore, in some ways they also embody Singapore. And so I think for most Singaporeans it's very complicated. On the one hand, you're hugely proud of Singapore and you're hugely proud of the Lee family for what they've achieved, especially for Singapore. On the other hand, of course, especially in Lee Kuan Yew's later years, he said some things which were very embarrassing, which the government had to disown. And like any family, I think people recognize that any family has its own disputes, its own tensions, its own family issues. But of course, if it were any other family, that would be a private matter. Settle it between yourselves, settle it in the courts. But because the Lee family controls so much power in Singapore, and how they behave and how they think has the ability to intimately affect our lives. For example, of course, Lee Kuan Yew for a while got it in his head that eugenics was the wave of the future, and so actually passed laws that were pro-eugenics and tried to tell us who we should marry, right? Graduates should marry other graduates, graduate women should have more children. And then he realized a few decades later it wasn't working and he discarded it. But that just shows you this family and what they think and what they feel has the ability to affect all our lives very intimately. And that's why Singaporeans are both incredibly concerned and incredibly worried about this dispute. In the short term, no. The way the system is set up is that the only avenue of political change is Parliament, and the PAP has overwhelming control of Parliament. Political action, political activism outside of Parliament is either completely proscribed or heavily restricted. It's almost impossible to change the political process except through Parliament. And so the PAP has done a really thorough job of controlling Parliament and, equally importantly, controlling elections. Elections in Singapore are not fair. They are heavily rigged through the gerrymandering, through the GRC system, through the town councils. So in the short term, the PAP control of Singapore is rock solid. And as long as Lee Hsien Loong remains Prime Minister, the family's control of the party remains solid. But in the long term, it's become quite clear just how brittle the system is, how reliant it is on one man, on one family, and how unsustainable it is. We've seen this again and again through history. We remember people like Augustus or Qin Shi Huang as great leaders, cruel, but very effective, and people who actually made great contributions to their society, transformed their civilizations, but they completely botched the succession. Both of them saw the country fall apart in, well, they didn't see it, but once they died, the country fell apart in civil war. And that's Singapore's long-term future right now, that there is so much power concentrated in one office. It's such a ripe prize. And what we're going to see is a lot of infighting and maybe even quite possibly overt political fighting over that office, because it's either that office or nothing, right? Everything in Singapore rests on the prime ministership. So in the long term, there is going to be a period of severe chaos. In the medium term, in the short to medium term, probably crackdowns to reduce any sort of dissent, right? Historically, splits in the elites have led to crackdowns by the establishment, right? Again, we see this in many different countries over history. But in the long term, without the authority of the founder, without the authority of the one man who's able to control all these different interest groups, things split apart. And so there will be some chaos, but in the long term, I have faith in Singapore, in my countrymen, that we will manage it and hopefully build the foundations for a better democracy. I think a lot of Singaporeans will have had a lot of faith in the Lee family. There has been a lot of effort also put into building up this image of the Lee family as a model family, and Lee Kuan Yew and his wife as a model marriage, and his children as model children. And so this is really showing that they're just as human as the rest of us. So I think, yes, it will help a certain amount of consciousness about the fact that our leaders are just human like the rest of us. They're not perfect. But there is a long way between being cognizant of that our politicians are politicians, self-interested, fallible, and actually being able to affect political change. You know, as I mentioned, in Singapore, that is very, very difficult because of the sheer amount of control that the government has. I think the important thing to remember is that it's two things. The first is that the most serious accusations are about the abuse of power, the use of the state office for private personal gain, the accusations of nepotism and favoritism, and that first of all, this is not new in Singapore. This has existed for decades under Lee Kuan Yew. And those are the important accusations that Singaporeans need to be concerned about. But even people who say, no, this is a petty family dispute, need to remember that family has an immense amount of power over our lives. The government, right, can dictate where we live, who we marry, how many children we have, our property, our pension funds. That is a huge, huge amount of power. And so a dispute within this family, even if you think it's merely a petty family dispute, which is not, but this can really change our lives. And so I think Singaporeans need to be very conscious and follow this very carefully and think about the kind of government and the political system that we want for ourselves.